In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gathered to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome back to Tholos Talks. Today in our series, Understanding the Thriving Trade in Looted Antiquities, we take a closer look at one of the most concerning tales yet, the story of Douglas Latchford, a once celebrated collector and now an unveiled blood antiquities trafficker. For decades, Latchford laundered priceless Khmer artifacts from war-torn Cambodia to Western museums, private collections, and auction houses. This was often accomplished with the complicity of the very institutions that were supposed to protect our shared cultural heritage. Joining us today to uncover the details of Latchford's exploits for the second time on the podcast is Tess Davis. Tess is one of the world's foremost experts on cultural racketeering. She's the executive director of the Antiquities Coalition and a longtime friend and colleague. She's also had firsthand experience with this case. Her career first collided with Douglas Latchford's in the fight over a single masterpiece known as the Duryodhana that set off a chain reaction, eventually leading to some of the largest art repatriations since World War II. Although Latchford died in 2020, the full scope of his crimes is still coming to light. So far in this series, we've examined the big picture from the global forces that drive looting and trafficking to the market failures that enable these crimes and the international efforts trying to stop them. Today, we put a human face on this issue. How did this one man help plunder on such a scale? What leading art experts helped him cheat the art world? Why did it take so long for justice to catch up with him? And how do you recover what's been lost, both the objects and the history they represent? Let's dive in. Tess, I'm so excited to have you back to dig deeper into the investigation that you have been working on for most of your professional career, and that's around Douglas Latchford and the illicit network that he set up around the world. You even were knighted by the Cambodian government for the good work that you did. But before we look into that case, let's talk a little bit about your role as the executive director of the Antiquities Coalition. And in all transparency, it's something that I founded and chair. But talk a little bit about the organization, Tess, and what its mission is.
Well, in simplest terms, relevant to today's podcast, I think the mission of the Antiquities Coalition is to combat crimes like those committed by Douglas Latchford, whom we'll be speaking about today. As we all know, there has been a lot of romanticization and glorification of art smugglers and tomb raiders in Hollywood, in fiction, and legends going back forever. But in real life, they aren't these heroes. They're figures like Douglas Latchford who are actually committing these crimes and causing great harm to do it. And so the Antiquities Coalition is working around the world to combat looting, trafficking, and other crimes involving artifacts, sacred objects, other cultural heritage, and also to make sure that the trade does not benefit organized criminals, armed conflict, or violent extremism, which it's happening right now. So we work to raise awareness of the reasons that the public should care about this issue, the reasons government should care about this issue, and law enforcement. And of course, those are all interlinked, along with how this is a threat to the vast majority of responsible collectors, art dealers, auction houses, and museums. So to get across that this is not a victimless crime, it's not merely a white-collar crime. This is a crime that's having real impacts, causing real harm around the world. And this is harm that, as we will talk about with Cambodia's story, takes decades, maybe even centuries to recover from some of the harm that's taking place right now.
Great. Well, thanks, Tess. I think that really helps set the stage for us. And we've been fortunate to have others from the museum community, from UNESCO, from law enforcement, and you coming to talk about the legal infrastructure. But what we really are looking forward to in this episode is to dig down into one specific case. So Douglas Latchford, he isn't really well known around the world, only in certain circles. And you've been profiled in the New York Times and the Washington Post, consulting on criminal cases related to his vast network that he had set up, and even featured on the Dynamic Doug podcast in a new documentary, Loot, A Story of Crime and Redemption. So let's start by talking about who is this Douglas Latchford and why is his story so central to understanding the illicit antiquities trade today?
Well, I just made the point that, this doesn't mirror Hollywood or fiction. Latchford's story actually is right out of the pages of something that could be a paperback novel or a film. I think the best way to start with Latchford is actually with his death, which came in 2020. And at the time, his obituary was published in the New York Times with the headline, Douglas Latchford, Khmer Antiquities Expert, Dies at 88. This title was an interesting choice because Latchford, he was a collector, he was a dealer. He wasn't a trained art historian, an archaeologist, or a scholar. He was this business tycoon who claimed to have made his millions in pharmaceuticals and real estate, but he died under a felony indictment fighting extradition to the United States for masterminding this organized trafficking network, which plundered countless. We're talking thousands, arguably tens of thousands of treasures from Cambodian war zones right into the world's top collections. It is truly no exaggeration to say that this man directly linked the Cambodian Civil War, responsible for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century, with the very elites of the art world. People whose names and photos are also frequently in the New York Times were closely tied to him.
It really is fascinating how broad his network was and how many of these storied institutions were pulled into it. So let's start by talking a little bit about Latchford's background and how he established his network.
Again, as a very interesting figure. He would not be out of place in a Somerset Maugham novel or a Graham Greene novel by any means. Latchford was an Englishman. He was born in what was still then the British Raj, and he journeyed as a young man to Southeast Asia in the 1950s, seeking his fortune, and he settled there in Bangkok. And like so many at the time, he found Cambodia to be this oasis of peace in war-torn Indochina. And, at the time, Cambodia was enjoying this cultural renaissance, a lot of which centered around this renewed and very rightful pride in its ancient heritage and its archaeological heritage. And Latchford, too, was drawn to this ancient past. In fact, he said to the New York Times, and I believe to the press more frequently, that he believed himself to be the reincarnation of not just any king, but one of the Khmer Empire's most famous kings, the face that is looking down at, and more seriously, that, all of this stuff belonged to him and these past lives. An interesting explanation for theft and trafficking. But in this period, again, we're talking the 1950s, especially the 1960s toward the beginning of the 1970s, he became a familiar face at Cambodia's temples. And when he visited them after he left, statues started disappearing. And I think it's important to stress that at this time in history, we know this not just from photos, from reports, but also from oral histories that many have been working, including myself, together at sites around the country, that, Cambodia's temples were very intact at this period. They were described as open-air museums because of the abundant statuary. But again, these gods and other sculptures started to disappear in his wake. And by the late 1960s, within expatriate circles in Bangkok, he was becoming known as Dynamite Doug, which is the name also of the podcast that you mentioned that really take the deep dive into him. And, sources have told me, and who knows if this is true or not, but he at least told people that he was using explosives to blow up temples or parts of them and detach things like bas reliefs and smuggle them over the border to really do in seconds what archaeologists, take months, years, decades to do. Now, if the story had stopped there, he might have just been this colorful figure, certainly very bad deed, but the story didn't stop there. Cambodia fell into war, and not just any war, but truly one of the deadliest, worst conflicts of the 20th century. And that would rage in different forms for decades. And so Latchford's crimes eventually started helping to feed this war, to help, the bad actors in it, profited by working directly with him. And this conflict, this crisis opened up the trafficking networks that allowed these treasures to flood into overseas collections, including many in the United States from some of our top individuals, some of our top museums.
Let's talk about your intersection then with this case, because as a young scholar, you traveled to Cambodia and started looking into this looting.
I've been working on this issue starting in Cambodia actually for about 2 decades now. First with the organization Heritage Watch, a very commendable group that is still very active in Cambodia, trying to combat looting and trafficking from the ground up there. But then with the University of Glasgow, and more recently as an attorney, and of course now with the Antiquities Coalition. 10 to 15 years ago, my path I didn't know it at the time, began to intersect with Douglas Latchford's over one particular piece called the Duryodhana, which is, experts believe this statue is really one of the top in the Khmer canon of art, which is saying a great deal because Khmer art is an incredible contribution to world heritage. And it showed up on the cover of one of the more prominent catalogs of one of the more prominent auction houses in New York. Interestingly, missing its feet, which remained back at the site in the jungles of Cambodia. At the time, a temple that was not so well known, but is just an amazing archaeological site called Kokir. And this case to recover this statue, which united people around the world of all nationalities and many leaders from Cambodia, including all the way up to the heights of the Cambodian government, starting again around 15 years ago, started to expose Latchford's role. Until this came to light, he had been able to continue this criminal career, not just for years, but for decades. We're talking since the 60s, at least the 1970s in earnest, quite successfully. And it was only with the statue that it all started to unravel.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because clearly to build up this kind of network, Latchford couldn't have done it on his own. So who were some of the other players in this movie, as you call it?
Thank you for raising that, because he absolutely did not act by himself. And again, his network, his success as a criminal, which was huge. I mean, again, we're talking 50-year criminal career here.
$1 million plus pieces. Yes.
Yes, to the heights of the art world, getting by with it, despite numerous red flags. And you can't do that without the complicity of a wide number of people. Of course, there are the ones who might immediately come to mind, corrupt law enforcement or government official or border guards, or here in this case, armed forces like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, organized criminals he was working with in Bangkok. I think it's important to stress that beyond these clear criminals, there are a number of people who enabled him, who facilitated him, who probably don't think of themselves as criminals, but were really crucial. And, we're talking art appraisers, conservators, shipping companies, art historians, those in auction houses, museum curators, all of these people, it really required on them at best turning a blind eye, and at worst, actually lying, doing all of these active steps to cover up criminal behavior.
And were there some specific individuals who were involved as well?
Yes, and we now know that one of the top experts on Cambodian art, she has now passed away, but was an advisor to a prominent museum out west in the United States, and a very credible figure, was crucial to Latchford's scheme. She would help invent provenances and also change, provenances and backstories to disguise their involvement. So, it's not just Cambodia that was a victim of this. It's also the historical record. I wonder, too, how long that will take to sort out. There's a lot of recovery that still needs to happen from this. But Beyond her, there's also a curator, and this is actually a huge part of the Dynamite Deck podcast at one of the United States' most prominent museums, who approved a number of acquisitions from Latchford, while at the same time we now know was accepting considerable sums of money directly from him too. So this really did implicate a number of key figures in the so-called legitimate art market, which I think also explains why it did take so long for this case to come to light, because a lot of people were counting on these things never being known.
Hmm. Because essentially they are legitimate. They're not fakes, but they're looted.
Yes. Although there is substantial evidence that Latchford was also having an active fake and forgery ring, which is also an issue that I think has not yet been addressed. I wonder if people do not really want to know the answers. Myself have talked to a man who very convincingly claims to have forged a number of pieces Latchford would find or loot or buy, a stolen object, really like it, not want to sell it. And so he would have a copy made, might change a little detail, and then sell it on. So I think that's one of the crimes that there's still a lot of potential to really uncover.
And based on the research that you've done, I know you can't give an exact answer to this, but how many museums or auction houses or others would you say fell prey to his fake provenance?
I think the shortest answer to that is too many. To be more specific than that, I think it is highly unlikely that if any of our listeners have stepped into an American museum in particular with Cambodian art, that they have likely seen a piece that was trafficked by Douglas Latchford. That's how key he was to the looting and trafficking of the entire country. In fact, that holds well for museums outside of the United States as well, with the exception of the Guimet Museum in Paris, which has a very well-documented collection. But that is how prolific he is. That if you have seen a Cambodian statue in a museum in the United States and in Britain and Europe and the rest of the world, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that more likely than not, it touched Latchford's network at some point. We at the Antiquities Coalition, there are countless looters and traffickers out there, some of whom may have committed more volume or, looted more pieces just in terms of numbers. But I really can't think of another figure who plundered one civilization, just so wholesale. I would love to be proven wrong, but more likely than not, if you've seen a Cambodian piece outside of Cambodia and outside of the Guimet Museum, and there's not a clear provenance for this piece predating the war, he or someone he was working with was probably involved in its theft.
So Tess, let's go back to the Duryodhana and complete this story. So you have discovered that a major auction house is going to have an auction and this statue is on the front cover. What happens next?
So again, this major statue appears seemingly out of thin air on the cover of a major auction house. It's kind of like missing its feet. And we know, due to the work of two conservators, Simon Warrack and Eric Bourdineau, that these feet matched perfectly a pedestal left behind at the site of Kokher, deep in the Cambodian jungle. And there's, no explanation from the auction house of how this piece got from there to its block. Once this connection was made by Bourdineau and Warrack, Cambodia intervened immediately with great support from UNESCO Phnom Penh and from the highest levels of the Cambodian government, reaching out to halt the sale. And the sale was halted.
What time frame was this?
So in 2011, the statue goes on the block in New York. Cambodia immediately intervenes to halt with support from UNESCO. It becomes quite clear that this piece was looted at some point from Cambodia, given the match of the feet. The auction house, even when presented with this evidence, refused to return the statue. In fact, I believe the exact quote from their lawyer to the New York Times was, this could have been taken at any point in its 1,000-year history. And my favorite, that the term quote unquote stolen is often used loosely. As an attorney myself, I'm not sure that's something I would want to say publicly to defend my institution, but as all of this was happening, as it so happens, I was going to say coincidentally, but it wasn't actually coincidentally, the same auction house was actually threatening me with a defamation suit for an article I had published suggesting that their sales from the 1990s may have had recently looted material from post-conflict Cambodia. And the war really was only ended in the 1990s. That had started in the 70s. So I was being threatened with this defamation suit at the same time as Cambodia is seeking to recover this piece from New York and bring it home. Found out later these two seemingly separate things were quite related, that the auction house had not wanted attention brought to any Cambodian pieces, even something, decades previous, while it was undergoing these negotiations with Cambodia. And as you can imagine, people working in Cambodia on this issue, especially, was a pretty small circle, and news traveled quite fast. And the statue, served as a tipping point for, I think, a number of reasons. One, it was such an important piece. Two, it was so clear that it had been looted. And while at the time we didn't have exact evidence, it's since become very clear this was taken during the war, blood antiquity in every sense of the name. Even before that hard evidence came, everyone knew that had to have been the case. There wasn't even a road to this site until the 1960s. And the French government, with all of its resources, it had taken them like a year to get a statue from this site to Phnom Penh in the colonial era. And so this masterpiece would have been out there for, decades in a collection somewhere, unseen, unheard of, unpublished. Could not have been the case. It really heated up. There was this year of negotiation, and the New York Times, to its credit, I think, was really responsible for moving it forward. In 2012, so a year after this piece first appeared on the auction block, the New York Times broke the story on the front page under the headline, "Mythic Warrior is Captive in Global Art Conflict." It was a great publication with extensive reporting from Ralph Blumenthal and Tom Mashberg, showing, the pedestal and the feet still at Coquerre, contrasting that with the rest of the figure as it appeared in the shiny pages of the sales catalog. We had hoped, I think even expected, that this would ensure its return. Again, the New York Times really had done its homework, presenting much, albeit done circumstantial evidence that the statue had been stolen during the early war years. But instead of caving, the auction house doubled down, and that led the U.S. government to finally, at Cambodia's request, filing what's called a civil forfeiture suit to recover and repatriate the statue to Cambodia. And this was bolstered by a series of insider emails from the auction house that will make you terrified to put anything in writing ever again. No one wants their emails in federal filings or in the New York Times. But, these internal emails were quite damning, because it was revealed that the auction house had been warned, not even by an outsider, but by the very scholar they'd hired to authenticate this piece, that it was, quote, definitely stolen. And they should return it to, quote, save themselves embarrassment. I think pretty clear guidance there. And then the U.S. government quickly followed up, having done its homework. They amended their complaint to include very well-documented evidence that the statue indeed had been stolen during the early war years, just 2 years after fighting had erupted between the Cambodian government and the Khmer Rouge. It had been trafficked as parts to Thailand, and from there really entered the heights of the art market. It was bought by Belgian royalty. Went through a major UK auction house that we now know laundered a lot of Latchford's pieces for him into a collection of Belgian royalty. And it was the widow of this Belgian who had consigned the piece to Sotheby's. Following that, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, particularly Jason Felch at the LA Times, I quickly identified another 5 pieces, not just from the same site, but like from the same room, the same inner sanctuary at the same site, likely at the same time by the same people, that all of which were, on display in prominent American museums from top coast to coast and in the middle. Truly a national problem. And Cambodia quickly called for their repatriation as well. Had its first success in 2013 when, to their credit, New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art voluntarily returned 2 statues to Phnom Penh, which started to I would say, a positive domino effect.
It's just been really a fascinating journey. And I think it's a wonderful case study in understanding the challenges with the antiquities trafficking that we really see today. I mean, you see all the elements of it: civil unrest, civil war going on, entities using this as a way to raise money, and collusion between Latchford and the Khmer Rouge to be able to sell some of these antiquities to fund their own activities. But also, I think it was very telling, Tess, when you talked about the time frames, to understand that this takes place over a long period of time. And so that these pieces don't always go into circulation immediately, or they go into private homes or private collections and perhaps emerge 10, 15, 20 years later. So that as we look at what's been happening in recent years, particularly in the Middle East, what lessons do you take away from this experience with Cambodia that we should be looking for now in a more modern context?
That's a hugely important point, and I think it's why Latchford's story really does matter and is important to tell, is that while it's a historical case study, it's not history. Who knows how many Latchfords are out there right now whose crimes are supporting the Taliban or Al Qaeda or drug cartels in Latin America. And I think the answer is probably one that would upset all of us, just because so much of this work occurs in the shadows. Latchford, again, was active for decades. I mean, frankly, a lifetime. I mean, that's the lifetime of a lot of people. And Cambodia has had great success, really unparalleled success in a lot of ways in recovering his stolen pieces in recent years due to amazing leadership in the government. This was of personal interest to the Deputy Prime Minister and Secretary of State Chan Tan-ee, who led a lot of these early negotiations, which I think show also how important this issue is to the government and people of Cambodia. Also, Brad Gordon, their American lawyer, who with his team has really been leading this effort forward. And again, has resulted in great success. But even the successes, by success, I mean, at the time, one of the recoveries from Latchford's estate, this was, as far as we can tell at least, one of the largest recoveries, if not the largest recovery of stolen art since the end of the Second World War. And that's still just a fraction. It's still just the tip of the iceberg of what he took. Every time we think we have our head wrapped around the harm he did, you find out about another collector who had $30 million worth of pieces from him. These are people who weren't on our radar at all. Like, how many of these are out there? I think if we look at, if you look at the case of Nazi looted art during the Second World War, there's still hundreds of thousands of pieces stolen then that have yet to be recovered. This is a road that's going to take Cambodia a long time to go down. And while these successes are important, and I think do and should give hope to countries like Iraq or Yemen or Sudan today, it does highlight what an uphill struggle this is. And how in many ways, Humpty Dumpty is not going to get put together again exactly the same way. Some of the harm can't be undone.
So, Tess, you mentioned that Douglas Latchford passed away. It seems that he was under investigation at the time of his death. Was there anyone else who was being investigated, or anybody who has been fined or gone to jail as a result of running this global network?
So Latchford, I would say he both did face consequences, but also by far, not the consequences he should have for all the harm he's done. He did die under a felony indictment fighting extradition back to the United States. And the United States government built an incredible case against him, and particularly the Southern District of New York at the Department of Justice and Homeland Security investigations. They tried. And at least I think we can take away that at least he died knowing that his reputation, which meant a great deal to him, that this is going to be the story associated with him forever, not the false picture that he tried to paint. And he did try to paint himself as the complete opposite as what he was, as, this helper to Cambodia, a generous benefactor. Anytime anyone looked too closely, he would donate a lot of money and support. The investigation, I would say there's positives and negatives to take away from this. On the one hand, he never faced justice in a courtroom. And I think all of us working on this, that was a blow. It was also upsetting to see that much of the coverage around his obituaries in various publications, painted him as this colorful figure as opposed to someone who was complicit in genocide. And I don't say that lightly. It's well documented. At the same time, I think this case really energized the royal government of Cambodia, which has taken immense strides and I think truly serves as a model, not just for the region, but for the world, and also serves as a hopeful example for the countries that are still going through this today. The information that was uncovered about Latchford's network helped to expose others. He intersected with other traffickers like Subhash Kapoor, who's also facing charges for this now. Another Janus-like figure who, with one hand, dealt with looters and with the other hand dealt with art world elites. And also the case of Nancy Weiner, who had been a close conspirator of Latchford's. In fact, he is an unnamed conspirator in her criminal complaint. She actually did face charges, and she was a very prominent second-generation dealer. And so while I would say the punishments haven't yet fit the crime, there's still clearly more that needs to be done. At the same time, this progress is so far beyond anything that was happening a decade ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. Things are changing. Authorities around the world, again, here in the United States, Homeland Security investigations and the FBI in particular are pursuing these cases. The Manhattan DA's office in New York. And they're going after the kingpins of this trade, and they're trying to go after them with criminal charges. It is difficult. I don't want to downplay the difficulties. A criminal like Latchford, as a private citizen, can easily operate across borders, no rules governing his behavior. But law enforcement, governments face very different challenges, which we see as the government was trying to extradite him back, and that ultimately proved unsuccessful. It's quite difficult to bring charges against these figures.
Exactly. So what would you say are some of the lessons we should take away from this?
I think an important lesson is that these trafficking networks that start during armed conflict long outlive the conflict. Once they're in place, it's very difficult to shut them down. And so the ones that we are seeing emerge now, whether we're talking about Yemen or Sudan or Ethiopia, this is a problem that's going to be plaguing these countries well after peace returns to them. And in fact, in some ways, peace opens up new doors for business. Two, again, I think his story makes it very clear that this is not a white-collar victimless crime. It might end up as a white-collar crime at the very last stages of it. But it doesn't start that way. It starts during things like genocide or armed conflict or, political upheaval, natural disasters. These crimes have very dark beginnings and enable additional crimes, enable additional armed conflict, enable terrorism with the money that comes from them. Three, and more positively, I think it demonstrates what can be done when there is a coalition of experts, of governments, of law enforcement, and responsible market actors who are willing to work together to expose these networks, send these pieces home where they belong, and prevent these crimes from happening in the future. I mentioned, the work done at the Cambodian government, starting under Deputy Prime Minister Sakhan at the time, who since passed away, and the Secretary of State. There's a huge leadership today with the Minister of Culture, Her Excellency Sakana. And, she's partnering with an American lawyer, Brad Gordon, who's working with French experts and American experts in U.S. law enforcement. And it really takes this type of collaboration to defeat someone like Latchford and to get these pieces home, because, again, he's not operating in one country or in one jurisdiction. It really does, as the Antiquities Coalition frequently says, is a global problem that requires a global response.
So, Tess, if people want to learn more about this issue, are there books or articles or things like that you recommend?
Well, I would actually recommend to start with the website of the Antiquities Coalition. We have a number of materials there. both that the organization has put together, our partners have put together, and also, we use it as a platform to reshare the excellent work of others, whether in academia and law enforcement and government, or, community advocates, like the India Pride Project or community groups that are fighting this issue from the ground up around the world. We're also very active on social media. Encourage those interested in learning more to follow us, because again, this, the Latchford story might be history at this point, but the same story is happening again and again in crisis zones around the world. But it doesn't have to. We would ask, when working with Brad Gordon and Cambodian colleagues like Tanner and Tan, to interview villagers who had been witnesses to Latchford's crimes, we would ask them, what can be done to stop this? And I think the consistent message was, as long as someone's willing to buy these pieces, someone's going to find a way to steal them. This is a message that is backed up, not just by a Cambodian villager, but by criminological resource. No illicit trade has ever been defeated at its source. It doesn't happen. It is a matter of defeating the illicit market, the black market. I think that's an important takeaway as well. Also, want to highlight the important role not just of governments, but of the responsible leaders in the art market. Again, the Met is to be credited for doing the right thing and making the first, public repatriations of Latchford pieces. Unfortunately, they still have a number in their collection, but they did make the first return, which helped to really energize the effort. Christie's Auction House also really proactively did the right thing when they learned about the looting at Kokir, went themselves to people who had bought pieces that had gone through their auction block, arranged the repatriation. These are pieces no one would have ever found. There's story after story like that. And so the responsible art market really can make a difference as well, both in righting these past wrongs, but again, I think most importantly, making sure they don't happen again.
Well, I know it can seem like an overwhelming problem at times, and you're often dealing in a dark and depressing world when you're dealing with these criminal gangs. But what is it that gives you hope as you look ahead?
I must say the last decade of success that Cambodia has achieved, which is testament to the work of so many people around the world, and especially Cambodian officials and experts within the country. I think many of us were at the point of giving up, right before this happened. In fact, I remember in 2012, I was speaking to a colleague saying, we've been working on this issue for 12 years and haven't seen a single statue go back. At what point does one just give up? And so I think it is important to hold out hope, because when things start to change, they often start to change in a major way. And that, again, I think is an important message to stress to the people who are going through these crimes today. I remember actually at an event the Antiquities Coalition hosted on the margins of the UN General Assembly meetings. It was attended by the Iraqi Foreign Minister and the Cambodian Secretary of State, who had played such a role in these repatriations. I overheard a conversation, but I don't think he would mind me repeating it here, where he went up, the Cambodian Secretary of State went up to the Iraqi Foreign Minister. He said, of everyone in this room, this was at the height of what was happening with ISIS. Everyone in this room, I understand what your country is going through. And I want to give you hope that, yes, you're losing so much in your lifetime, but with your children's lifetime, I guarantee you these pieces are going to be brought home. And they'll be there for your children and your grandchildren to enjoy one day. So I do think there's positive takeaways from this as well.
Well, Tess, I think that's a beautiful note to end on, and really appreciate you sharing your personal story, but also really the intriguing story of the network of Douglas Latchford and what a character he is, and the many important players who unfortunately were part of his web. So thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much.
This series, Understanding the Thriving Trade in Looted Antiquities, reminds us that the past is never truly behind us. The theft of heritage is a present tense crime, one that carries lasting consequences and calls for our vigilance, our voices, and our actions.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Baseline Institute. Available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Baseline website.